Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Begin by telling me about where you grew up and your family life and so on, and that would be a good place.
Well, I was born in New York City on 86th Street, West 86th Street. My family was Jewish. My father was a surgeon in New York. And my mother was an artist, a painter, but she was not professional in the sense that she never sold anything. But she spent all of her time at the Art Students League and produced lots and lots of stuff. And it stuffed all the closets, and she used to say, it's nothing, it's not worth doing. But at any rate, my father didn't want her to earn money, and so he would take this as a criticism of his own ability to support the family, which was, part of the cultural look at that time. And we were taking care of my brother, and I had a brother who was 2 years younger. And we were taken care of hired help by a nanny. And that was my first intimate multicultural experience, because the nannies were never American. The first one was Swiss, the second one was German, and so on. And we slept in a room with her, so that it was a very intimate relationship. And I saw my parents. My mother spent an hour with me every evening before my father returned from his office. And then he would see me for a few minutes when they went into dinner. And I did not eat my meals with my parents until I was 13 years old. Mm. So it was always eating with a nanny.
Where were your parents from?
Oh, my mother was a second, third generation American. My father's family had come from Hungary and moved into the slums of New York. They had a dry goods store. And he was a prodigy who got himself way ahead in school and went to Columbia Medical School. And he was so young when he graduated that he lied about his age. And since he had been born in Hungary, nobody ever knew. But that's how his career started. And he became a very distinguished surgeon and teacher. So we were very comfortable. But what shall we say? His parents, his father died on the trip here, the trip to the United States. He had tuberculosis and apparently faded out before he got here. And my grandmother married again. And she had two sons with the first husband, and then two more sons with the second. And there was always some tension between these. And she had come with my father to this country because he was 2 years old, and she didn't want to leave such a little child behind. But she left his older brother behind in Hungary. And the resentment over that matter never died.
He eventually immigrated to the States?
Yes, he was brought when he was about 10. And he became a lawyer and very prosperous in New York also. But there was always a feeling that it had been unfair and that Mama hadn't done the right thing and so on. Anyway, this grandmother and her Hungarian husband lived in the time that I knew them in a little house in Rockaway in Long Island that my father had bought for them. And outside this house was a little tiny garden that my grandfather, Max Stark, cultivated in a European garden. Every row was perfect, and he had raised beds And the whole thing was about the size of this room. But he grew everything, apples, flowers, vegetables, and was very proud of it all. And he was quite a character. He had a Hindenburg mustache, and I remember I used to like to sit in his lap. And we had this great game where I would try to pull his mustache, and then he would try to bite my finger, and I would giggle, and this went on and on. And he went to synagogue every morning, and he took a swift drink of Schlivovitz before he left, just to keep warm. That was his purpose. And my grandmother mostly cooked and took care of the household, and cooked enormous heavy meals for us. And we would go out there. We were taken out there by the governess. So during the period that I remember, it was this German governess who would take us out there. And we'd go on the Long Island Railroad, choo-choo, and go and visit them. And it was a strange relationship. We never stayed there. We just went for the day.
And they didn't spend much time in your house in Manhattan?
They never came. Never. Well, among other things, they had no way of getting there. They didn't drive. And my grandmother, their English was creative. They were not, they were fluent in German and in Hungarian, but their English was broken, and or what shall I call it? I think creative is a better word for it. My grandmother would talk about how Harry will bring the machine. Harry was my father. And the machine was the car. And there were things like that where substitute words were used, and everybody understood what they were about. Anyway, so multicultural it was from the beginning. The nurse was from Germany. They were from Hungary, and clearly not fully Americanized. And my mother's parents, on the contrary, lived on Park Avenue. And they were the contrasting case. My grandfather was a pediatrician, and he sometimes took me for an ice cream sundae, and he wore, striped pants and a black jacket, and in the summer a boater. And I only realized when I started seeing films of old Russia that he was really a typical exemplar of Russian dress and behavior. And he was a very learned fellow. He spoke Russian and German and French. And I knew him when he was very old, though he still had his pediatrician's office. And his principal hobby was to roam the bookstore, the second-hand bookstores, which were then on 59th Street. They don't exist anymore, but there were many, many of them. And to try to find himself what he might like to have. And I liked him a lot, but I never knew what to talk to him about, because he was from another world entirely. His wife was awful. She had been a school teacher, and at the slightest provocation, she would recite the names of the capitals of all the states of the United States, and other by rote performances like that, and she must have been a terrible teacher.
How long did you maintain this very formal relationship with your parents until?
Until I was 13 years old. And but you understand, I went to college when I was 15. I mean, I should start at the other end and say they had the wit to send me to a wonderful, wonderful progressive school run by Teachers College called the Lincoln School, which was an experimental school that the Rockefellers had sent up for their sons. But they had to have the furnishings of a real school, so that there were lots of other students there. And and it was supposed to it was supposed to epitomize the philosophy of John Dewey. And it was the experience of my life. I mean, every time, all my teaching, all my contacts with students, all my contacts at universities have always been to try to replicate this school.
Really? Can you give me an example of what?
Well, they didn't consider kids too young to talk about anything. So, in addition to sort of normal things like math, which we had to learn, we were taught things about the city around us, and about the poverty of the poor, and the shacks in Central Park, and there was a great deal of learning by doing. So I remember in the 4th grade we had a long study of Egypt. But we didn't only study Egypt in books. We built pyramids out of clay bricks, and they somehow got papyrus for us to make paper out of. I mean, this was a really elite place where they knew how to get their hands on materials that would make everything we did interesting and lively and do the job. So, and in terms of we read Plato, and we read all sorts of other utopian works, and then we were asked to write something about our ideas about what would be a suitable utopia, and we wrestled with things like government and democracy and all of this at very early ages. And that sort of particular project, I seem to remember, was around 10th grade, so we were beginning to be adolescent. But it was just a splendid school, and they used the contacts from the student body to capture people to come and speak to us from the big world. So Alfred Stieglitz, the photographer, came, and Franz Boas came.
Really?
Yes, and Franz Boas was there not to talk to us, but to measure us. And he measured our heads, and he measured our wrists, and because we were all the children of immigrants, and he was very much interested in who else came? I don't remember at the moment, but they would. We felt that we were in touch with the world, and that our parents lived in a very restricted social circle, that they hardly knew all of these wide contacts that were available to us. We didn't have anything to do with arranging it, but the school did, and it was quite magnificent. So, but what happened to me there, because I spoke French, which I learned from this German governess, so I speak French very well, but with a German accent. I advanced through various classes rapidly. They promoted me once for reasons I don't understand. And then at some point, because of high school credits and things like this, they said that you're ready to go to college when I was 15. And I thought that was okay. My parents thought it was not okay, but there was nothing much they could do about it because I was being so encouraged by the school. So I applied to Vassar and other places and Barnard, and my parents said I must go to Barnard because they wanted to keep an eye on me. So if you go to Vassar, you'll come home pregnant. So I'd given them no reason to believe any such thing, but I did then go to Barnard and live at home and commute on the subway.
And what was your study of subject?
I majored in English literature because I thought I would become a writer. And I hated Barnard. it was, and I also thought I would do a pre-med course and become a doctor. That acquaintance with the dogfish discouraged me.
Dogfish?
The dogfish, yes. Well, we had to do dissections in a lab, and we were given a workbook, and we were supposed to find the things that were in the workbook. And my dogfish never seemed to be the shape or size that the workbook suggested. And you had to fake it because that was necessary. And it was those kinds of maneuvers which got me very disappointed. And it was also, any pre-med course was crowded and purely lecture and purely memorization, and I decided that was not for me. So I switched to English literature.
Did your father have the expectation that you would pursue
He did
medicine?
not want me to become a doctor.
Oh.
He said, women don't belong in this profession.
Oh, I see.
He had one or two female proteges whom he had trained, but he didn't think it was the place for a woman.
So you studied literature?
Yes. And that was, again, very trying. Lots of memorization, from Shakespeare's sonnets to everything else. And I guess the nadir was a history course in which the person who taught it, as European history, read from a book which he had not written. And they had the policy at that time that if you were absent very often, you failed the course, whatever you did on the exams. There was no consideration given. So it seemed to me to be, the whole thing was hypocritical in the extreme. So I got organized and I became the head of the student curriculum committee. And I started a movement to change the curriculum. And I made enough trouble so that Dean Gildersleeve called me in and said, you shouldn't be doing this. But by that time I had already had a couple of public meetings, and I had also recruited some faculty members to agree with me about this stuff. And so I was successful in this very small political move. No big changes took place at Barnet at the time. I thought they should have some education about sex, and they had nothing. They had hygiene, which was, I don't know what. But it never got anywhere near sexual matters. And these were girls who were all experiencing life. So.
And this gave you your first taste or exposure for politics?
Yes. Yes. Well, it was my first practical. I mean, I had been active even in high school in this wonderful progressive school, but there was no opportunity. I was not rebelling at all. But in this place, I was in full rebellion, and there were faculty members who were very sympathetic and thought some of these rules that they had were ridiculous. Anyway, it was a very childish thing, but I zipped through there also because I decided toward the end, when I saw what the employment possibilities were. And for an English literature major, the best thing was to become a typist at Time magazine or some such place, in the hope that somebody would notice you and eventually let you do a little bit of writing. Or you could go to Macy's and work on their
catalogs.
Well, they had sort of advancement management.
Now, when you said writing, did you have in mind something along the lines of journalistic writing?
No, I was going to write fiction. I was going to be a big star.
But
and of course, some of my classmates did that, in fact, successfully. But it was quite impossible to. What I realized was that it was a much better idea to go to law school than to go into the job market. That the job market would be demeaning and not satisfying at all. and the question of advancement and eventually being able to do something I wanted to do would take years.
Yeah.
And I knew that in law school you went through and then you were slotted into a job. Little did I know that women were not put through that way, but I didn't realize that till much later on.
So you finished Barnard quickly.
So at the end of 3 years, I started in law school, and I did the last year as an overlay. I took some of the big exams. There's a general literature exam you had to take, and I did that. Anyway, law school, of course, this was during the beginning of the war, and men were being drafted. The law school had shrunk. There were very few women, but there are also not all that many men, not as many as there used to be. And outside we heard the people marching, the recruits marching in the street. It was, that was a very strange time. There were, when you were called upon to present in class, the professor just went down an alphabetical list he had and called everybody Mr. So that there would always be general laughter when a woman stood up, because it would be Mr. and then it wasn't a Mr. and so on. And then there were some professors, that one who was famous for this, named Julius Goebel, who made fun of women. I mean, one of his pleasures was in tormenting the women in the class. And he would have them come up to the front and he would say, "Didn't you have any education? Where have you been?" All sorts of stuff. And I had never had a course in American history. This is progressive education for you. I had never had a course in American history or in British history, except in college. And that lay loosely on top, and it was not the kind of history that he was interested in. Anyway, there has been a survey of women who went to Columbia and their comments on their time there, and many of them said it was a demeaning experience and insulting and so on. Now that was true of some of the professors. It was not true of all of them, thank God. Some of them were very encouraging, and some of them even noticed if some bright answers were made. But there again, the mode was, as it is in many law schools even today, you presented a case and then you were asked questions and you were to argue. It was not, and it was an adversarial situation. And I remember in one class, the professor said, "It's people like you that made me vote against admitting women."
Do you remember what he was responding to?
What I had done, he asked me, I had given the wrong answer to something. He said, "Did you read the material?" And I said, "Yes, I read it." But I obviously had not understood it. And it was, but then the curious thing, I discovered something that I just had no preparation for. I thought I've got to bite the bullet and go and see this man in his office. And I did, and he was very genial and very pleasant. And I suddenly realized that this was, what he did to me in class was vicious. That he had there was nothing personal about this. And anyway, I got along with some of them. And by the time I reached my last year, I did not have a very good record up to that point, but I had some dazzling grades in my last year and was recognized to be one of the bright people and became a research assistant of a man named Jerome Michael, who was a criminologist. And I also had the experience of having worked with Carl Llewellyn who was interested in anthropology and who wrote poetry and did other things that most law professors did not do. And I liked him very, very much, not for his political views, but for his understandings of law, because he explained to us that every case had, nobody went to court without there being another side, and that this was inherent in the system. And he was a contracts person, and so he said, you can only understand the meaning of a contract or the legal implications of a contract if you understand the background of the industry or the circumstances under which it was written. And so I began to see that somebody was interested in the social context of legal stuff. Mm-hmm. Now, in the meantime, I had gotten married. I got married when I was 18. Mm-hmm. And I married a lawyer who was in the army, so I never saw him unless I traveled to whatever camp he was in. And we didn't really have a household. I mean, once in a while for a summer or something like that. But so that broke up my legal studies very much, because I was always leaving for the weekend, leaving for every holiday, and trying to go and see him. And but it had its own interesting experiences. He was stationed in Richmond, Virginia for a time, and became the aide-de-camp of a general. And I began to understand that generals were just people, because this general had been a silk stocking manufacturer in his civilian life. He was a Southerner, and he was very charming. And he decided that what I must do for him, because I was a law student, was to go and visit the families of bereaved families, and tell them what the financial rights of their deceased member was, and explain to them what was, what they could do and where they could apply. And I was very scared to do this, and I found it very, very uncomfortable, but I had to do it. And it was also very interesting to me that I didn't meet any people who were crying. I met people, and this was not so long after whoever it was had died. I met people who were very greedy and who wanted really to know about the money and how they could get hold of it and so on. Anyway, my husband didn't leave the United States during that time. And well, after law school, there came job hunting. And I had chicken pox during the job hunting season, so I was all covered with little marks and very embarrassed to have such a childish disease. But, and most of the firms where I was interviewed, first of all, I had my parents in the background saying, you've got to go work for a Jewish firm, there's no other way. It's very, very difficult for a woman to be accepted even in a Jewish firm, but certainly not in a non-Jewish firm. And in all these firms, they asked me, are you married? Are you going to have children? How soon? They were interested in these very personal things, and they thought it was their business, because they figured they were not going to get their money's worth out of you if you did these female things. Anyway, the job I did get and did accept was through Carl Llewellyn, who had put in a very good word for me in a firm called Spence, Hotchkiss, Parker and Duryea, a Wall Street firm, which at that time had what was considered an enormous number of lawyers. It had 40 lawyers, which these days is minuscule. But they were in big business, and he, well, the important thing for me was that they had just made a woman a junior partner. Her name was Soya Menshikov, and she eventually became the dean of Miami Law School, but that was years afterwards. Anyway, it was very encouraging that there was a woman in this firm who had gotten ahead, and there was one other young woman who, in the apprentice position that I was in. And there, what interested and excited me was that the standards of the product, because we had to produce briefs for the partners, was very high. And we were given every support. We were given secretaries and we dictated, and we, did all the things you're supposed to do, right from the beginning.
Was there a particular area of law that you focused in?
No, their plan was to rotate you around from one partner to another through a year, and then a marriage would be made between a partner and an associate, and you would become specialist in that department. So various kinds of law, some of them were in business law, some of them were in banking, some of them were in other things, and it depended how it sorted out.
And this was still, it was during the war years still?
Yes, yes. And out of the 42nd Street floor of our office, we could see the ships of soldiers coming back. So that was a very different experience from going to school. And there were all the usual office things. There was the lecher in the way of a partner who one had to be nice to but avoid. And, there were also the young men whom I found very attractive and was very nice and spent a lot of time with. But they always arranged everything so that one's work went beyond the 5-day week. You spent all Saturdays working. Everything was urgent. Everything was an emergency. Well, what I realized very soon was that the way one, Soya was a real exception. The way one got to be a partner was if one brought in clients. And I couldn't imagine crashing the social circles that produced the clients that this firm had. I didn't know any of those kinds of people, and I was 21 years old. How was I going to stand on the street and lasso them? So I felt that I had no future there in terms of high ambitions. And in terms of short-term ambitions, I felt that in some ways the work was very dull, that I read assiduously the opinions as they came down from the courts, because you had to be ahead of the game. And whenever a client came in with problems, you would then have to sort out which cases might be applicable and how you would sort out his affairs. But a lot of clients came in with the kinds of questions that I couldn't possibly answer, like, should they float more stock or shouldn't they? Things like, business advice. And I realized that one had to know something about the business world, and that I was not going to be able to do that. So I didn't feel like a wild success, even though I was very much a pet in this law firm, and did well. And in external judgments, I was doing fine. But I I weighed the possibilities. And then, in the spring, at the end of my first year, Delford Taylor, who had just been made a general and had been made the head of the Nuremberg trials, came to New York to recruit lawyers because the war had ended. This was in 1945, 46. And his lawyers were leaving him. His lawyers were all in the, it was Jackson's staff, and they were all people who were in the Army or the Navy. And they wanted to go home to their wives, and they wanted to go home to their jobs. And they did not want to stay in service. So he was coming to try to recruit some junior people in law firms to find people he could get to come to Germany and to serve on the legal staff. He would never have heard of me, except that I had two sponsors for the bar, and one of them was a senior partner in this firm where I was, Kenneth Spence, and the other one was a man named Max Lowenthal, who was himself a lawyer, but a lawyer who had had a very strange career. By the time he was in his mid-30s, he felt he had made enough money, and he'd also married a wealthy young woman, and he wanted to become a lobbyist, which again was not much done in those days, and he was a lobbyist for the unions. He had worked for the ILG, LUU, and other. So, and it was he who knew Taylor. When Taylor asked him if he knew any young people who would be good and have shiny, bright eyes and help him out, he said yes. He suggested me. So Taylor immediately started the things moving to hire me. And I thought this would be a wonderful job. And because it was a serious job, and it was in the international world.
How did I take it you met him in New York at first, and he...
I think I went to Washington.
Okay.
And met him there. I heard about him in New York.
Okay.
But
and how did he present what he was going to be accomplishing?
well, they were going to try the major figures of the German government. This was public knowledge.
Right.
And he wrote before he died a book about this. We were clearly going to be given a list of the defendants, and it was not something in our option to choose any of these people. And it was a question of making the cases against them.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, I was interviewed by a number of people in Washington. I went to the Pentagon, which I think had just opened at that time. And I talked to them, and I can't understand why, but they decided to hire me. And then, of course, the question became, what's going to happen to the husband?
Mm.
And so he started to apply for a job with the same outfit, and he eventually, contacts were made, and he got a job too. But these were independent of each other. Anyway.
So this was still at the end of the first year that you had worked at this firm in New York.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And when they told you you were going to be hired for this work, it meant packing everything up and going overseas for this.
Well, I asked at the firm, can I take a leave of absence?
Oh, yeah.
They said, yes, we want you back.
Okay.
So there was not,
Mm-hmm.
and there was a lot of fun made of me. The senior partner who had been my sponsor said to me, so you're going to hang Germans? and I said, no, I don't know what I'm going to do. And there was this, the feeling, well, altogether in the firm, the whole unease about a young woman lawyer was very considerable. I remember one of my first, so to speak, cases. Soya was away, and I was sitting at her desk. I was given her a desk, and she had 4 telephones or something, and it was so terrifying to me have all this happen at once. Anyway, I was told that she was going to represent an owner of a factory who had hired underage kids in his factory, and that he was going to appear before a labor board, and that I must represent him because she was busy elsewhere. So I met this man who must have been in his 50s, and, I was a young thing. And
so underage yourself.
And when we got to the labor board, the labor whatever he was, mediator, said, "Which one is the lawyer?" Anyway, that's the sort of reception with which I was met in general.
What did your parents make of this gig at the Nuremberg trial work?
Oh, they didn't want me to go, but they didn't want me to go for many reasons, and one of them was that some doctor had found spots in my lungs which suggested that I had tuberculosis, and they thought it would be very dangerous for me. But I dare say they didn't want me to go on general principles. That they felt it was a dangerous situation. And
in what way?
I don't know. I think probably being in a foreign country where I knew no one, and no one was responsible for me, and except for Telford Taylor, and I hardly knew him.
Yeah.
That no one would be looking out after me. And then this tuberculosis thing came up, and I was not going to take no for an answer, so I found another opinion, and I found a doctor who said, A, you probably don't have tuberculosis, because many people who live in New York have these things in their lungs. This is just a general consequence of living in New York. And B, if you do, that doesn't mean you're going to die. You just be good, drink a lot of milk, and have regular X-rays, and you'll see whether you're okay or not. So I was able to convince them that there were other ways of looking at my lungs, and I was able to go.
Did you need to have German skills to?
I knew some German. But I certainly didn't speak well, and high school German, book German, a couple of years of school study. But there were translators, and there were all the apparatus that non-German speakers could use was there. That part of it was not really a problem. And I had also had a vision of being able, in some way, to sort out which Germans were more or which ones were less culpable, and to take a pro-German view of that. But that was, again, not possible.
So tell me once you arrived, how were your various expectations? Because clearly you've been reading things in the newspaper over the years and had heard.
Well, Taylor said to me, "What case do you want to work on?" Which was a nice way to open my career. And I said, I want to work on the industrialists' case, because I believe they had the option of helping or not helping the regime. While a lot of the other people were in inferior positions in relation to their government. and did not have those choices, but I believe the industrialists did. And Farben and Krupp were the cases I wanted to work on. And he said, fine, that's what you'll work on. So start with the Farben. And I did. And
this was Farben, the guy, IG Farben.
IG Farben, the chemical company that made the gas,
Right.
and that also employed slave labor. And very, very early in the game, I went to the Farben headquarters with a galaxy of 3 or 4 German speakers as assistants to help me go through their files. And that was a very instructive and very distressing experience. I went, to begin with, I didn't know how to drive. And I had to get from the place where I was billeted to the Farben headquarters every day. And I had to go to the motor pool to get a car. And there had to be a driver because I couldn't drive. And I took some of these people with me, these assistant people. But anyway, what I found was there were tremendous warehouses full of documents. It was like a factory, floors and floors and floors, and you went in and there were shelves of manila folders with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of documents. And then I asked to meet the person who was in charge of this building. And it was a German who had been in charge of the files and libraries of IG Farben before the war. And these materials had come out of a salt mine where they had been hidden during the war because it was feared that they would be damaged in bombing. So they had just been returned to Farben headquarters and put out on the shelves. So I asked him, well, you must know where everything is because you had to do it. Oh, I have no idea where anything is. In short, I got no help from him at all. And he said, there's no order, they're just randomly shelved. And I felt sure this wasn't so. And I felt sure there was a lot of documentation of the slave labor and the maintenance of it. They must have ordered food for them, they must have ordered other equipment for them, there must have been ways in which one could find materials. And I talked to my little assistants about this, and all they could find was a telegram that had been sent to Hitler congratulating him on his birthday, and things like this, which were completely not incriminating and had nothing to do with the kind of thing we were really after.
But you wouldn't have expected people to just cooperate.
I didn't expect that these files were in the charge of a German, or that they were in charge of a Farben man.
Yeah.
I thought that they would be in the charge of an American.
I see.
And there was an American major who did have, what shall we say, formal control. And I went to him to complain. And he said, oh, that Nuremberg thing, that's terrible. They shouldn't be trying these people. It's all a bunch of Jews who were attacking these nice Germans who were doing perfectly legitimate things. And what do they think they're doing? And he didn't say you come representing them, but essentially he was saying that he would give me no support whatsoever in my complaints about the man who was in charge of the documents, nor would he help me get the kind of documents I needed.
Well, was there any, just as a curious point, was there any point during these various investigations and involvements in which your identity as a Jew became relevant?
No.
What other kinds of approaches and researches did you engage in when you were over there to try and get materials for the case?
Well, there were materials circulating in the main office, some of which I packed together into a brief. But you know, they were not nearly as useful as these other things would have been if I'd been able to get hold of them. And, well, I learned simply, I finally met a young chemist who was also interested in the Farman documents and who was interested in their formulae because he was going to take them for the government, for the American government. And I asked him if he would be of any help. Absolutely not. But he had only one objective himself, and he was not going to help the Nuremberg people. And it was clear to me there that certain of these military people were anti-trial, anti the Nuremberg trials, and that they were not going to move themselves. They would, of course, give permission to look at things yourself, but and I don't know what happened later, how much stuff was given. But I had another personal encounter that was difficult. When I got back, I was asked to evaluate the translators and people I'd taken with me. And there was one who hadn't done a stitch of work, and I complained about her. What I didn't realize was that in a small organization like this, everything you do is public. And she found out about it immediately. And she then went to Taylor and said that I demanded a limousine and a chauffeur, and that I didn't. She turned the thing around and said that I didn't do any work, and that fortunately my contacts with Taylor and my connections with Taylor was such that he didn't believe any of this. But it would have been bad if he had. And I realized then you have to watch your step all the time, and you can't, and you certainly can't speak against anybody in a public way without expecting to have it come back to you.
So what kinds of conclusions, professional and also personal, did you gather from your experience in this commission?
Well, there was a legal problem, which was to connect these particular people with the acts that were so heinous. What was not difficult was to connect the firms that they worked for, or the government with, you know, you could know who set up the camps, or who set up the gas, or who did what. But you could not connect the executive people who were in the government with this operation, and that was the difficulty.
So there weren't prosecutions.
I suggested, and was again reprimanded for making such a suggestion, that what we should do is get hold of these people's secretaries, because they would know what we needed to know. And I was told, you can't exploit these little people. It's not right, it's immoral. I found that very strange.
Yeah.
But that was the attitude. And so, you know, they wanted to prosecute, but they wanted to do it cleanly without any embarrassments. And I was too young and too unimportant in this whole institute. You know, I was the lowest paid lawyer there. I was the least important person on the staff. And although I had connections with Taylor, I never used them for anything. So,
how long did you spend?
6 months. At which point, I didn't live with my husband there. The whole divorce thing was in process. And I had to leave to get a divorce because it all became very awkward, and I was involved with a man there, and it just not a good thing. So I came in June. I left at Christmas,
and you returned to the.
Then Taylor asked me to come and work for the Nuremberg trial staff in Washington. And I said no.
Were you already back at the firm that you had
I
left?
didn't go back. I spoke to people there. They wanted me back, but I didn't want that. I had my eye on the UN because I wanted to go into the international world, where I saw that there was a tremendous amount of inefficiency, and that people were floundering and making their own law. You know, they were creating things, and it was clearly an opportunity for a young person that would have been immense and wonderful. And so I told my friend Max Lowenthal that I wanted a UN job. And I went to my old professors at Columbia Law School and told them. And Max said, I have a very good friend in the State Department who's very high up, and he'll be able to help you. But he's in a little trouble right now that he's very occupied with, and he won't be able to help right away. And his dear friend who was going to help me was Alger Hiss. So the job at the UN never materialized because Alger Hiss's fate began to get worse and worse and worse during the course of that year.
Yeah.
So while I was studying for my anthropology exams, I was realizing that I was not going to be able to do this.
You started to take anthropology in preparation for this.
But I went into the PhD program, and it was the only. See, what I told the anthropology department was that I was interested in what was known in the social sciences about who had responsibility for what a group of people or a tribe or a nation did, and how were those, how was that worked out? How was that explained? How was responsibility allocated, and who had ideas about this? Well, of course, anthropology is a complete blank on this subject.
Yeah. It's still a question, I believe.
But that was true in general. I mean, it was even true of political science. I looked at all the social sciences. Political science was studying the relation between government and administration and populations, and sociology, nothing doing. Sociology was about the family and all kinds of stuff, but not about these political issues. So what seemed to me to be possible was that maybe I'd be able to work my way through the anthropology stuff and come up for air with some political stuff in the end. And the faculty people were very welcoming.
This was at Columbia?
At Columbia.
Yeah, so who was there at that time?
Well, all kinds of remarkable people. Alfred Kroeber was there. But as it turned out, and Joseph Greenberg, the linguist, and let me see who else, Charles Wagley, Julian Stewart, all kinds of notables. And I took the measure of each of these people as I studied with them. But I was not going to be able to look at my subject for the first year. I knew that. I mean, they had no way to adjust their requirements. I had to go through their usual paces, and that's the way it was. That's all. And so I decided, well, I'll do that. And at the end of the year, I'll go to the UN. Well, at the end of the year, I didn't, and I looked at other job possibilities, and it seemed to me sensible to continue with anthropology, attractive and interesting. No.
All right. And this question about allocation of responsibility and this remain part of what you perceived your inquiry was about while you were in graduate school?
Yeah.
But you ended up writing your dissertation about the Inca, completely different time and place, yes?
Yes, well, this again was a problem. By that time, I had linked up with the man who became my second husband, with Kalman Moore. And he did not want me to go and do field work because he said, I may not be around here when you come back. I'm not going to just sit and wait for you. So I decided I had to do a library dissertation, and that I would take an empire. I was going to compare the Inca and the Aztecs, and sort out the kind of political systems the two empires had, and what their tax system was, and how they managed with armies and labor and so on. And so it had to do with the same kinds of issues that I was involved in at Nuremberg, but in a documentary and rather ancient setting. But the issues were the same. I mean, the Inca were not, I was not looking at them as an exotic entity, but to try to understand who had power and who didn't. And indeed, the book I wrote was called Power and Property in Inca Peru. So, and that's what it was about. Yeah.
Okay. And so when you completed your degree at Columbia, where did you go from there?
Well, I'm trying to remember exactly. I could not. It took me a long time to finally do the dissertation. There were some years between being in school and doing the dissertation. And in the meantime, Crescent moved from one job to another in his history jobs. He didn't have his PhD either. And there was no way for me to work in the universities where he went. They had what were called nepotism rules, and they couldn't hire the wife of somebody who was already on the faculty. So what I did was write. I remember a particularly dramatic moment when I was sitting in the basement with my work on an iron board and I was writing. Anyway, I wrote and published, and I published everything that I wrote at that time. And I should say that my dissertation won a publication prize, so that this was, it had all gone well. But none of these universities would touch me. So I just labored on.
And this was all in New York?
We were in Binghamton for a while, and where else was he? We were at a couple of small universities. We were at Wesleyan, or was it at Wesleyan? No. Oh, he went to Yale for a while. That wasn't possible. I don't remember. I don't remember too well. But that was not, there were no professional openings where I was.
But you maintained correspondence with people you considered to be in your field, or you just worked on the ironing board?
I worked alone. I had no contact with anybody. I didn't go to meetings because I was told, who's going to take care of the kids? And so I took care of the kids. But I wrote in the evenings, and a whole bunch of my first articles were produced that way. They were published in the American Anthropologist. They were accepted, by the best. Oh, I should say that my first publication was a history of the department at Columbia, because Kroeber had been asked to do that since he was the first PhD in anthropology in the United States, and the first PhD produced by Boas.
Yeah.
And he said he didn't want to be bothered, but he would give me his notes, and would I write it? So I did. So that my first publication was a history of the of the anthropology department. The second publication was then this book on Peru, on Inca, Peru, excuse me. And then after that, I started writing. So I wrote some stuff about kinship terminology because I observed that in Crow-Omaha terminology, the women did not have a mirror image. They didn't use the same terms as the men, and it was not a mirror image thing. And that all the literature was about the men's use of terminology. But this, it was published, but it didn't attract a great deal of attention. And then I wrote another one, which this is 1963 and 64, another one which was more related to this psychoanalytic interest. One of the puzzles about many of these tribal peoples is they have an origin myth. And in the origin myth, there's a first family. And the big question is, who do the children of the first family marry? And does this conform to the kinship system that they have? So if they're patrilineal or they're matrilineal, does that show up in the, and in the Cain and Abel stories, wives show up without any designation, they just are.
Right.
But what I did was tabulate statistically from many different peoples some of the surrounding myths and stuff about this question of the origin myth and who the first family was and who the second families were. Then came my first professional break, and that came, believe it or not, from Laura Nader. She held a conference on law and anthropology that was sponsored by the Wenner-Gren Foundation and held at Burg Wartenstein, the castle that they had bought for such conferences, which they no longer have. Too bad. But they did have it then. It's a castle which was too cold in the winter to use, so it could only be used in the summer for meetings. And so I wrote a couple of papers for that conference. And again, my rebellious self manifested itself. And I was trying to make the point that simply the way laws also are not always enforced, that the rules of kinship and descent, which are taken literally by anthropologists, are very often bargained over and very often undone. And so there were sitting, all these much older, much better established anthropologists who had done this, who had taken it all literally, and I was trying to make the point that it was not as fixed as they thought. And that went all right. It didn't. Anyway, I was launched after that conference, because then I knew all the people who were in law and anthropology, especially the English people. Shapiro was there, Luckman was there, Nader, of course, who had organized it. Bohannon was there. Everybody in the business who had a name in law and anthropology was there. So I became one of the boys. My first academic job was in California after Kress had gotten a job at UCLA. So I simply was a camp follower of him
Mm-hmm.
up to that point,
Mm-hmm.
because there was no possibility of employment.
Mm-hmm.
But I was being published,
Mm-hmm.
and although I didn't go to meetings, I got away enough to be able to go to this conference in Austria.
Mm-hmm.
And it was set up in this strange way where because of course most of the conferees were men, the woman who ran it, whose name I've forgotten at the moment, wanted them to be happy. So she supplied the equivalent of geishas, young Austrian girls in costume, to sit at our tables at dinner, so that things would be lightened up. Of course, they knew nothing about anthropology. I mean, it was good enough that they spoke English, but and so that there was a strange element of that.
Mm-hmm. Who among the legal anthropologists or anyone else would you say took up your? Did you make friends with or took up your case most specifically?
Well, Gluckman in particular was interested, but I don't know whether he was that interested at that early a time.
Mm-hmm.
He became more and more interested over time.
Mm-hmm.
My own materials were very seldom cited. I mean, it's been a very, very odd and invisible career, distinguished and invisible. Then the Biennial Review of Anthropology asked me to do a review of all legal anthropology. It was the first article of its kind. And that came out in '69. Okay, well, I should tell you a little bit about Cressip's work. He was studying 19th century politics, and in the period when they still had records of voting, poll books that recorded the name, occupation, and vote of every member of every community. And that was until the 1870s. And during this period, to explain what was happening politically was always explained in terms of what was happening in Parliament, when of course a great deal had to do with the social pressure that was put on people in the countryside to vote the way the owner of the land that they were on wanted them to vote. And with records like this, they had to do so. Anyway, we lived in England while he did this research a number of times. And one of the times in the early 1960s. And you understand what this meant, because in those days, there weren't Xerox machines and there weren't ways of reproducing what you found. So Cressip found that there was some kind of camera on a pillow, a sort of transparent pillow, that he could photograph these poll books. And then we developed them, and the kitchen was hung with two kinds of things: these poll books drying and the diapers. And the English apartments that we were in were in people's houses, and they were very cold, and I could tell you the history of the various pets we had and their troubles. People who burrowed through the rugs we had. Anyway, what matters in terms of my career is that in the early 1960s, when we were in England, Cressip got an offer from UCLA, and we decided to go. And so in a mid-year time, we moved to California. And we started looking for a house. We stayed in a hotel, and in the drawers of the bureau in the hotel, I found a holster of a gun, you know, one of these holsters that you put under your arm, a shoulder holster. And there were other peculiar things. And then we went to a grocery store, and in the car next to us there were some monkeys, and they were in diapers. And I thought, this California is more strange than I ever thought it would be. But after that, nothing peculiar happened. So, well, a little peculiar things, but they were a natural kind, with a tree falling on somebody because of the rains and so on. But it wasn't somebody we knew. Anyway, what happened was we bought a house which was inexpensive because the valley in which it existed had had fires through the valley, and it had been spared, this house, as many were. The fires skipped houses, and they didn't universally destroy anything. And the result of this was that by chance, the house we were in was next door to an anthropologist's house named Joseph Weckler. He was separated from his wife, so he didn't live in the house, but his wife did, and so did the kids, and I met him. And he was at the University of Southern California. And Southern California, USC, had at that time decided to make the anthropology department vanish. And this was because they had two anthropologists, one of whom was an archaeologist and one of whom was this Weckler guy. And so the archaeologist decided, I see the handwriting on the wall, go to another California university. There were labor shortages in the teaching faculties everywhere, so it was not hard to find a job. And so Weckler became the sole anthropologist at USC, and his department was amalgamated with the sociology department. And he said he badly needed another anthropologist, and they would give him the position if I would take it. And I thought, wowie zowie, this just came across, you know, without trying, without applying, without anything. I mean, he knew about me because I told him about me, but I had not formally done anything to approach the university. Anyway, so he fixed it for me to get a job as an assistant professor at USC. And I thought that was dandy. I didn't like being in the sociology department, but I thought, well, you know, you take what you get. But unfortunately, Weckler was an alcoholic and very depressed. And 5 weeks into the term, he killed himself. So I found myself the only anthropologist at USC and in an alien sociology department. Well, I immediately started being political and trying to get the money for his position given to me to hire some young graduate students from UCLA to supplement the anthropology department. And I did get 2 of them, and I began to feel, you know, things are moving. And indeed, there came a little bit later a time when there was a vacancy in a senior professorship, and I asked that be allocated to anthropology, that they would really begin to have a department if they had a very senior person and me and 2 junior people. And it was allocated to me in the beginning. The sociologists weren't very swift on their feet at that time, but they were later on, and they took that position away from me. But in the beginning, I had it. And actually, it was through that I made my first contact with Harvard, because I tried to get a Harvard person to come for that senior job. A certain person who didn't yet have tenure, but who was on on the cusp. Anyhow, this is the kind of university where you had to teach what was in the catalog. It had nothing to do with what you knew or what you were interested in. There were certain kinds of courses and you had to give them because they were offered, and honor required that the catalog offerings be filled. So I taught things that I'd never heard of before, like American Indians and all sorts of stuff. And it was a very arduous year in that way, because teaching unfamiliar things, and the teaching schedule was not light. It was difficult. But at the same time, things were beginning to make me very happy, because I was beginning to meet people at UCLA, because Kressip was at UCLA, and it wasn't really because of that, because the first person I met was Michael Smith, who had heard of me through Max Lowenthal's son, who was David Lowenthal, who was a professor of geography at University College London. And they had both worked in the Caribbean, because Michael Smith was a Jamaican who had worked in the Caribbean and worked in Africa. And so David Lowenthal told him about me and about my book about power and property in Inca, Peru. And Mike Smith read it and thought it was wonderful. So he got in touch with me. And I was very pleased to know him and very pleased to, begin to make friends in the profession. And his good friend in the department was Hilda Cooper, who had just come from South Africa. Leo Cooper was in the sociology department and she was in the anthropology department. So with those two, I had a rollicking social life. We read many of the same things. We talked about many of the things that interested us. And I became invited to all the seminars and things of interest at UCLA in anthropology. So that although I was isolated at USC with my little junior people, I didn't feel alone. And moreover, I decided that with them, I had to do something that would make us come together. So we ran a seminar with the three of us, always present, and it would concern some topic that interested all of us. And we would have the students doing field work in Los Angeles and producing materials for the seminar. And one of them studied Alcoholics Anonymous, another one studied gangs, another one studied a hippie community. They were all interesting materials because these kids had personal connections with these things. And it was much closer than one might have expected if it had gone from the outside to go study X. So that was going and very, very satisfying. And on the UCLA side, I also found great pleasure in speaking to Smith and speaking to Hilda and talking to them about the things that interested me and that interested them. Now, what happened was, eventually, I was fighting the sociology department politically because they had their eyes on this professorship that I had. And it was a short-term thing. We appointed a man named Kalervo L. Oberg, who was a retired anthropologist who had worked in Latin America. And it was clearly going to be a short-term appointment. And my thought was that we would then be able to appoint somebody younger and more lively, and as soon as he retired from that job. But by that time, the sociology department had wised up to the existence of this, and they claimed the professorship. And I was outraged. And I had decided to take a year of leave and go to the African Studies Center at UCLA for my year of leave. I was very indignant. I was still not tenured at USC, and I had published more than, or as much as anybody there. I couldn't understand why they didn't tenure me, and I couldn't understand why they were taking this professorship away from my little tiny anthropology group. So I thought, you know, in your face, you'll see, I will simply depart for a year. So I went to the African Studies Center, which was headed by Leo Cooper, and participated in their seminars and in all their activities. And they had a very, very interesting seminar going at the time on pluralism in Africa. And there the questions were, was ethnicity or class going to be the source of the breakups of the newly independent states, because this was in the 1960s, early 1960s, and they were all being independent and getting rid of their British connections and feeling their muscles. But there was worry about how, you know, the signs that there might be some disintegration. And I was very interested in this political situation. Anyway, that seminar on African pluralism, it turned into a book, of course, in which I did not contribute. But people were brought in who were in African studies from Britain, from France, from all over, and it became a way of connecting with a much wider professional circle, an international professional circle. And they weren't all anthropologists, but they were very interesting people. And at that time then, my relation with Smith and Cooper, or the Coopers, became deeper and more intense, because they entertained all the visitors, and I was always included. So that was a tremendous break. And I decided in the course of this that since all the work on legal anthropology, most of the work had been done in Africa, not elsewhere. There were a few things from elsewhere, but Africa was the place where most of it came. And because, as it happened, the British were very much interested, and the French were very much interested, and the Germans were very much interested in the local legal systems, because as successor governments, they wanted to control the people through their own legal system. So that's how anthropologists got into the act. So I decided I must work in Africa, and I studied Swahili at UCLA because I decided I must go to a part of Africa where I can study the language at UCLA. And I identified an area that I thought would be very interesting, namely to go to Tanzania, but to go to the Chaga, who had a cooperative one of the first cooperatives on the continent of Africa, perhaps the first, that was African run and had come into being in the 1920s. And I thought, oh boy, I mean, it's a country that's become socialist. Nyerere has brought socialism to Tanzania, and no doubt that Chaga will be very enthusiastic about it because they've had this cooperative all this time. Needless to say that they were very anti-Nyerere and anti-socialist, but I didn't know that until I got there. Anyway, I thought this is a very interesting political scene, and I will study their law and also their situation in relation to these larger entities, the colonial government, the socialist government, local government, and so on.
Did you have some help gaining access to the Chaga?
Well, not really, but it turned out that I couldn't be sponsored by the anthropology department because there was no anthropology department. All the African universities had banished them. But the law school was happy. The law school at Dar es Salaam was happy to sponsor me. And it's as a lawyer that I got there. I would not have been acceptable as an anthropologist. I mean, they knew I was an anthropologist. This has to do with rules and fuzziness. They knew I was an anthropologist, but it was, the formal sponsorship was of me as a lawyer. And I didn't know any Chaga, and I didn't know anybody who knew any. So, and the first time we went, Krasov would not let me go by myself. He wanted to see what I was going to see, and he wanted the kids to see too. So we all went as a family. And I started off by going to the local court, which was a quarter of a mile away. And I asked the magistrate if he would let me sit in and listen to the hearings, and if he could find somebody who could explain what was going on. Because I said it's one thing to understand the language, which I understand very imperfectly, but to understand what these people mean to each other, I will need somebody to explain these things to me. So he said, I have the man for you. He's worked in the courts elsewhere, and he doesn't come from this village, he comes from a village, some villages away, but I'm sure he will be interested. So I found out what a white-collar person was paid, and I decided, all against everything that I had been taught at Columbia, you know, you mustn't pay informants, you mustn't enter into these kinds of relationships. I decided I would pay him what a white-collar person would get for his time, and we made an arrangement, and I'm still in correspondence with him and his family, and I financed his son going to school in Russia, and it had all sorts of consequences in the long run. But he was at that time quite a young man, and it went well. He spoke enough English mixed with Swahili to explain things to me, and it was very much what I wanted. And we started in this court that was so near where I was staying, but very quickly we started to go to his village and to meet his family and to go to the court that was closer to his village. And I got inside, and from that experience came a great deal of what I've written. I mean, it has many other dimensions, but this was my leg up. And I hired other people. I hired people to teach me more Swahili, a school teacher from the next village, and I hired others because I was sort of feeling the ground to see if this man would work out. But it turned out he was best of all, and the magistrate was quite right to. Then after that, I think I went the next summer. I went many, many, many times, and I would have to look at the books to see which years. But it was many times. And at first, of course, I had read the account of Chaga law that was written by a missionary in the early 1900s, published in 1926, but his name was Gutmann. It's full of strange interpretations, but it's very thick and full of information. And I thought, oh well, all this superstition stuff, they've surely rejected it, because by the time I got there, they were wearing tailor-made clothes and behaving as if they were into the modern world. But it turned out that a lot of this stuff was still floating about in their lives, and that there were a brother jealous of his brother might well work witchcraft on him and keep his wife from bearing children, or make his goats die, or whatever. Any misfortune could have such an explanation. And it isn't that people were sure, they never were sure, but they thought it's a real possibility. And certain people got nailed with these accusations, all very sub rosa, because they didn't want vengeance to be taken on them. So I was surprised, and I went with the flow, and I learned a lot about their intra-lineage disputes. Now, it turned out that the population doubles, I don't know, every 20 years or so. That's the air conditioning
Okay.
making itself manifest. And so the Chaga, who had a population of about 100,000, was the German estimate around 1900. Now are somewhere around 700,000 or 800,000, and it's the land shortage is extreme, so that a father can no longer guarantee his sons enough land to grow enough coffee and enough bananas to support himself, his wife, and everything else. So what I also found out was that, in fact, if you do genealogies and do careful understandings of what they're telling you, you begin to understand that people leave, that half of the young people now leave and go to the cities, that in previous generations they left and went up mountain or went down mountain to settle on other lands that were available. And that, so what one looks at is something like an intact traditional society that can only be intact because it sloughs off all the inconveniences. So that was a tremendous revelation to me, and but it was very exciting to learn about these things, because I felt very unsure of myself, very unsure that I wasn't being led by the nose, you know. Why are they telling me this? And thinking, oh well, maybe they think white people are interested in witchcraft, so they tell me this stuff, and it's really to ingratiate themselves with me, and it's not because they really believe it. So I worked in more than one village, more than one family. I was always checking up on myself to see, to try to verify what I had. But the book that gave the full account, because what I did in the book was to give, first of all, a historical account of what happened, and to put the Chaga in the middle of a trading entity that in the 19th century was trading in as far as Lake Victoria and as far as the coast. And they were getting ivory and hoes and slaves and all kinds of things. And all that business was stopped by the colonial entrance, because they started to get a monopoly on the trade. And so the Chaga were left, high and dry in some of these matters. But I tried to put the historical perspective on it. Somebody had written a history of the Chaga, which was all a history of different chiefdoms and how they fought each other, and which one was dominant and which one wasn't, but it had no other information in it. There are specialist things like that exist, but I was able to put that together with very different kind of information. Then I looked at the courts and some of the court cases in the various periods. And then what I did was make a chronicle of this lineage, which I knew very intimately from the first man who came to help me in the courts. This was his lineage. And their ins and outs, what they did, what they didn't do, what they stole from each other, what they accused each other of. And it's absolutely fascinating to me.
When you were in England, did you circulate in the academy there some?
Yes, very much. Well, what I did, some of this has to do with Mike Smith's life. He decided that his son must not be drafted to go to fight in Vietnam. And so he decided to leave UCLA. There were other reasons too, and he was eventually given the professorship at UCL, at the University College London. And in these many trips to England for the year, I went regularly to the seminars at UCL, and I indeed had an appointment there as a visiting something. And I went also to Shapira, to the ones at the London School of Economics. And I was invited to the seminars all around, and including the one at Manchester, because Gluckman by that time was very much interested in me and my work. And he used to stay with Gressop and me when he came to London. Mm-hmm. So there was
what was he like, actually, Gluckman? There are many stories surrounding his personality.
Yes. Well, he was a man of immensely self-conscious dignity, and he was a presence. When he came into a room, he would dominate the conversation, the physical presence. He was always a dominating figure, and certainly at academic meetings, he always took the lead. And he would hold his head like this and appear not to be listening, but he would hear everything. And then when he sat up and the voice started, everybody collapsed. Now, people were very angry with him a lot of the time, partly because he was so insistent on his own points of view. And they also were irritated by his personality. Certainly a number of young anthropologists found him intolerable. The ones he favored, when he became interested in somebody, then he was forgiven everything and they became acolytes. But if he was just performing, they did not like him. He was always this sort of mix, and he was very British. And politically there was this strange mixture. His wife was a communist, and he flirted with communism but didn't ever belong. And but at the same time, he was very understanding about the position of colonial administrators. And many of them were in very difficult situations. I mean, they were not all bad guys. And in this period, in the middle of the 20th century, when people in this country became aware of the liberation of the colonial places, they became so anti-colonial that anything like this was considered intolerable. And he was considered to have been a sort of servant of colonial administration. And he wasn't any more than anybody else was. The story of his fieldwork is very sad. At one point, after he had done a great deal of it, he was in a canoe and he was going to try to shoot a bird. And a man in the canoe stood up at that time, and the man was shot. And Gluckman had to leave, and there was a lot of trouble about this. And he was sort of cut off. And there were other things that people hated about him and that Nader and others differed with him about. And I tried always to make peace. His interpretation, he did the first study of a court in Africa. And this was an African court run by Africans. But of course it was a colonial court with African personnel. And he sort of ignored that. I mean, it doesn't enter his theoretical frame. And he looks upon the court as a place that expresses and determines the norms of the society. And that in each case, they are using some norm to determine the result in the case. And then sometimes he says quite candidly that he doesn't know what they decided, how they decided. But it's as if he was using an analogy to Western legal ways of behaving and transposing it to this court. And he did that not only about their procedure, but also about their concepts. So he saw them as having concepts of property, of wrongs and rights and things like this, very analogous to those in the Western world. And his father was a lawyer, and so he learned some of his father's conceptions, and he would throw in a little Latin and this and that. Also, he started out, as you can see from one of his books, I don't remember which one, he had the idea that when he went to the Barotse courts, he was going to illustrate one of Sir Henry Maine's theses about primitive law. That this was going to be an example, a living example of Sir Henry Maine's ideas about primitive law. Now, all this is rubbish. It's what do we say, a mistranslation of one system into another. But you can winnow out the interpretations and look at what was actually happening, because he describes it clearly enough so that you don't have to take this overlay too seriously. But he was very insistent on this, and he was insistent on it, it seems to me, for very, very nice political reasons, because he wanted to show that Africans were as rational and as logical as Westerners, and that their system was really much more like ours than unlike ours. So you can understand why he was a controversial figure.
Yeah. And where did your work fit relative to that idea or others that were about at his time? I mean,
well,
because you also worked in the courts.
Yes, but I emphasized the way in which they had been modified, altered, and the way they were adjusting what they were doing for their own purposes. I mean, for instance, in the courts that I went to, one of the things one would assume is that, well, because they could appeal to a court in Moshi, the town nearby, and it could even go higher to higher courts. But the way the judges prevented this from happening was the judge was also the stenographer and the fact finder and everything else. And the judge would say, the evidence does not support the contention of the plaintiff. And so it was always on the factual ground that they made their decisions. So it was impossible to appeal. It was impossible for, no matter how dissatisfied somebody was with the judgment, they couldn't very well appeal. Now, there were exceptions, but this is the general style and technique. Well, this kind of thing either Gluckman didn't observe or it didn't happen in the court that he was looking at. But I saw much going on that I couldn't fit into the kind of framework that he had posed. But I didn't use it to attack him. You see, this is a difference in style. I wanted him to like me, and I also respected him for what he had done. And well, anyone who wanted to read this very boring book could have seen that the material would not support his ideas. That was not a public thing. Many anthropologists have advanced their careers by attacking somebody in a prominent position, and that was simply not my style, and I can't tell you why. But what I did was try to characterize the kind of comparisons that were being done in the 1940s and 50s. Well, first of all, before in the 19th century, and then in the 40s and 50s, and then today. And trying to show that the items being compared are completely different. And this, of course, plays into my whole interest in process. And that, in fact, if one is interested in, let's say, the process of economic development or the process of political corruption, you can't easily compare the way you could to find out whether a particular people was matrilineal or patrilineal, whether they had gardening or not, whether they had cattle or not, and so on. And so there's been a complete revolution, and that is very much connected with a time-conscious anthropology, a concern with the passage of time and an anthropological description as a moment in time, not a thing, not an object.
What are you working on right now?
Well, apart from trying to sell this book, a man at Oxford has asked me to produce. He's an archaeologist, and he's editing a volume on the archaeology of Kilimanjaro for the Cambridge University Press. But he wants some sort of general article on Kilimanjaro for this book. And I don't know him or anything about this, but I said, look, I wrote a book about Kilimanjaro, and if I can get permission from the people who own pieces of it, because the Cambridge Press owns the right to publish, the University of Rochester owns the copyright. And if I can get both of their agreements to use the text, I will then try to produce a compressed thing that will be suitable for a book of this kind. That's what I'm engaged in at the moment, and it's driving me mad because it's very difficult to compress a 400-page book or 350-page book into 40 pages. I should never have said yes. And the most recent thing I did just before that was an article for this book of John Borneman's, a paper on chance simultaneity, sort of what goes on in the anthropologist's life and environs while she is doing anthropology, and that is not directly germane to the anthropology, but that is germane to the general situation. And so I've included a lot of sort of anecdotal material about what happened when in this strange climbers lodge that I lived in when I worked on Kilimanjaro. And for example, there was a general who came every year to climb the mountain to show that he was still virile and tough. And he was very handsome, and he had marvelously polished boots. And he, you know, I asked him things like, what does the army do in a place like Tanzania when there's nothing doing about wars? He said, the purpose of the army is to keep the government in power. And I thought this was astounding. I mean, it's so candid an answer.
Yeah.
And there were, anyway, some of the things that were happening in connection with all this, with this paper. There was a man, Achaga, who went to Yale, and who happened to be at Yale when I was there, and he was there in political science. And I helped him to write his dissertation because he really wasn't into what was expected academically. And he wrote it as a sort of propaganda thing. And then I explained to him that that's not what's being asked, and you need to do it another way. And the material in his footnotes then came to be in the body of the dissertation. And he got his PhD and has had excellent positions in the international development world since. But one of the times when I was in Tanzania, he was the chair of, I think it was I've forgotten the name of it, it's somewhere in my notes, a section on development in the university, a section on, and what it really was a sort of espionage thing in which they had to look at where all the government money had gone into development projects, and to see whether any of them had succeeded, and if not, where the money went and what happened, and this and that. And he was then a big cheese in the government in this way, because he had his hand on all development projects all over Tanzania, but his actual position was in the university. Now he said to me, if you get into any trouble, this is where you go. Go to my brother. He's in Arusha. You can get there, and he will protect you. Now, that he should have anticipated that I might have trouble, that I never thought of this. And his whole view of the world was quite different from mine. And he's done wonderfully, and I now email him, and he emails me. Life has changed for him as well as for me.
Right.